January 17, 1944. An overcast, muddy afternoon in southern Italy. The air hangs thick and cold, carrying the metallic scent of recent rain and the pungent smell of canvas and diesel smoke. Inside a makeshift prisoner processing station, a shell's card. Damp stone farmhouse outside casino, a German lieutenant, Gunther Richter, sits on an upturned wooden crate. He is exhausted, his face grimed with battle dust and the exhaustion of perpetual retreat. His heavy wool tunic is ripped at the shoulder, a trophy of the final short skirmish that ended his company's stand. He stares blankly at the stone floor, his mind numb from the shock of capture. But then, a sound. It is a peculiar, rustling sound that draws his eye. An American sergeant, robust and almost impossibly clean in his newly laundered fatigues, is standing over a battered wooden table, carefully examining the contents of a small, rectangular cardboard box. This is not the familiar sight of weapons or maps being sorted. This is an inspection of sustenance. Richter, trained in the grim calculus of modern warfare and the Spartan necessities of the Wehrmacht, had expected an interrogator, a guard, a cell. He did not expect this casual display of enemy comfort. The American pulls apart the contents of the box with the practiced indifference of a man who knows where the next dozen boxes are coming from. This moment, small and isolated, represents the quiet, inescapable truth of the war, a truth already decided by factors far removed from the courage of men on the battlefield. This is the transition from a war of blitzkrieg and daring strategy to a war of sheer, insurmountable industrial muscle. The box itself, the simple, compact, wax cardboard of the K-ration, becomes the symbol of an unfolding apocalypse for the Axis mind. It sits on the table, neat and unassuming, but it is an artifact of unimaginable power. By the early winter of 1944, the time of the war had long ceased to be a matter of military genius or superior training. It was now a grinding, merciless conflict of logistics. The soldiers of the Third Reich and their allies in the Imperial Japanese Army had been indoctrinated into a mythology of Germanic superiority, of Volk strength overcoming material disadvantage. They were told that the enemy was decadent, soft, and disorganized. They believed this doctrine because they had to. It was the only thing that made their own escalating hardships bearable. Their expectations, forged in the fires of deprivation, dictated that the American, the so-called soft enemy, must be similarly strained. The German soldier lived on a ration system designed for efficiency and scarcity: hard biscuits, ersatz coffee, often chicory or roasted barley, synthetic honey, and the relentless reliance on captured stores. Euphemistically termed living off the land, the K-ration, designed for one day's fighting, contained an array of items that defied the very definition of necessity as understood in Berlin or Tokyo. The K-ration was the product of the U.S. Quartermaster Corps, an organization tasked with feeding the largest, most dispersed army in history. It was a logistical marvel born from the understanding that a well-fed soldier is a fighting soldier, and that the American soldier, accustomed to the plenty of the civilian economy, needed more than mere caloric survival. To understand the shock experienced by Richter, one must first grasp the depth of the scarcity that defined the Axis war effort. In the late 1930s, Germany had gambled on a short war, a blitzkrieg that would seize the resource base of Europe before the vast industrial might of the United States could be mobilized. When the war stretched into years, this gamble failed catastrophically. The German economy, operating on a centralized, often inefficient system, was perpetually starved of key materials, oil, rubber, and food variety. German military rations, though scientifically calculated for energy, were monotonous and frequently supplemented with low-quality substitutes. The chocolate they received, if they received it at all, was often a meager, chalky compound. Cigarettes were strictly rationed, and luxuries like chewing gum were non-existent. The contrast with the United States was the chasm between two ideologies of production. While Germany repurposed washing machine factories for artillery shells, the United States built entire, purpose-built cities of war production. In 1943 alone, the U.S. produced nearly 86,000 aircraft, a number that dwarfed the combined output of the Axis powers. More critically, for the soldier, this industrial engine produced not just weapons, but comfort. The war machine was not merely about tanks. It was about the millions of tons of dried egg powder, the countless miles of thread for uniforms, and the sheer volume of canned, pre-cooked meat that reached the remotest front line. This abundance was transported across the perilous Atlantic by a stream of Liberty ships. a symbol itself of the American industrial response. These ships, often constructed in under 2 months, were not elegant or fast, but they were inexhaustible. They carried the material proof of America's economic superiority, including the millions of boxes, like the one on the table in convoys that stretched, impossibly, from horizon to horizon. Lieutenant Richter watched the American sergeant unpack the K-ration, and the expected reality of a war of equals began to dissolve. The sergeant first pulled out a small can. It was marked canned meat. Richter's mind, accustomed to the stringy, preserved horse meat of his own field rations, registered the sheer volume of the can enough for a single man's generous meal. This was followed by a packet of crackers, seemingly fresh, still crisp inside their moisture-proof wrapping. Then came the items of profound psychological impact. The American pulled out a block of chocolate. It was thick, dark, and wrapped in foil of pure, unadulterated confection. Not the thin, ersatz compound Richter had tasted years ago, but true chocolate, a luxury reserved for the highest party officials back home, now provided without question to every single frontline infantryman. Finally, the American produced a small, perfectly sealed packet of cigarettes. The symbol of American democracy and abundance in this context was not a tank or a plane, but the humble cigarette pack. It was a small, mass-produced item that spoke volumes. The inclusion of tobacco, a non-essential item, was the ultimate sign of a production system so vast and so secure that it could afford to manufacture and distribute a daily pleasure for every man, everywhere, indefinitely. For a German officer whose allowance for personal luxuries had been trimmed to near zero, the sight of a government-provided comfort item, freely available, was a staggering revelation. Richter's realization was not a sudden, dramatic moment of ideological collapse, but a chilling, slow-motion dawning of the inevitable. The realization was this: the American war machine was not just fighting, it was living. It was replicating, on the battlefield, the comforts of peacetime civilian life. The ration box was not a survival kit. It was a mobile pantry. It included chewing gum for jaw exercise and dental hygiene, toilet paper, water-purifying tablets, and instant coffee with real sugar. The variety was shocking: a fruit bar for dessert, crackers for texture, and even blue willing powder for a hot drink. It suggested a deep, almost contemptuous casualness about resources. A captured German logistics officer later summarized this transformation in perception in a classified report: "We fight for survival. They fight for convenience." The American ration demonstrates a total disregard for the very concept of scarcity. When we open one of their rations, we are not seeing food. We are seeing the output of 1,000 factories that we cannot bomb, and 1,000,000 workers we cannot starve. This was the transformation. The war had stopped being a contest of armies and had become a contest of production systems. The K-ration proved that the Americans had already won the production war, and by extension, the entire conflict. Let us delve deeper into the factual evidence that supported Richter's unspoken, crushing realization. While the German U-boot campaign struggled to choke the Allied supply lines in the Atlantic, American industrial output surged forward like a geological force. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. built over 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 6,500 naval vessels. The sheer tonnage of material moved was biblical in scale. The quartermaster corps utilized a standardized, modular system, packaging everything from socks to steak in ways that were easy to ship, stack, and distribute, whether to the scorching deserts of North Africa or the freezing foxholes of the Ardennes. Consider the simple can of meat. A German field kitchen might serve a stew of mixed, often low-grade ingredients boiled in large vats. The American C-ration, the bulkier forerunner to the K-ration, or the meat component in the K-ration, was often ready to eat and individually packaged, a can of ham and eggs or meat and beans. This individual packaging, clean, sealed, and diverse, was an extravagance to the German mind. It demonstrated that America had solved problems of preservation and distribution on a scale that Germany could not even attempt. Constrained by its raw materials and its ideological focus on Grossraumwirtschaft, a continental European economy, the psychological impact of this material superiority was felt not just in Europe, but even more acutely in the Pacific theater, where the contrast was magnified by extreme conditions. For the Japanese soldier, the experience was one constant, grinding hunger. The Imperial Army's logistical system was a tragic failure, relying almost entirely on rice balls. dried fish, and the expectation that soldiers would forage or capture supplies. As the war turned, Japanese units in places like Guadalcanal and New Guinea were reduced to eating roots, leaves, and insects. The casualty rate from starvation and disease often exceeded those from combat. When American Marines stormed an island position, they carried with them not only their M1 Garand rifles and grenades, but also their sea rations tins of stew, hash, and canned peaches, easily carried and immediately consumable. A Japanese soldier, living on a fraction of the caloric intake, seeing the litter of discarded sea ration cans, each a perfectly preserved, high-quality meal, experienced a terror far beyond that of machine gun fire. He was facing an enemy that was not only militarily dominant, but materially immune to the hardship that was defining his own existence. The humble cigarette pack-hour symbol is the recurring motif in both theaters. Accounts from the Pacific often mention Japanese soldiers, after an overwhelming assault, finding and carefully collecting the discarded American cigarette butts, treating them as treasures. German officers, accustomed to the ersatz tobacco and thin papers of the Heer, were stunned by the sight of premium American brands such as Lucky Strike or Chesterfield, freely distributed. The cigarette pack represented the sheer, almost arrogant confidence of the American supply chain, a confidence born of limitless resources and uninterrupted ocean travel. This disparity created a profound, cancerous doubt among the Axis ranks. The German soldier was fighting for a vision of a 1,000-year Reich, a harsh, demanding, and ideologically rigid future. The American soldier, seemingly, was fighting for the right to chew gum, eat a chocolate bar, and smoke a decent cigarette, all while maintaining the finest standard of living on the planet. The K-ration was the concrete manifestation of the ideological conflict, the plenty of democracy versus the forced scarcity of totalitarianism. The reports filtering back to German high command throughout 1944 began to reflect this psychological demoralization. They noted that captured American equipment was not only technically superior, the M for Sherman tank was more reliable and easier to repair than the complex German Panther, the Jeep, an unparalleled utility vehicle, but it was also excessively finished. The small details of ergonomic design, the quality of the paint, the sturdiness of the packaging all suggested an industrial base that was not laboring under wartime constraints, but operating at peak efficiency, creating surplus quality. When the German Lieutenant Richter finally ate the contents of the K-ration, it was not the taste that struck him, but the totality of the experience. The energy provided by the concentrated fruit bar, the satisfying crunch of the crackers, the rich, immediate warmth of the hot coffee. It was a sensory assault. It was a tangible, undeniable proof that the enemy's logistical tail was not strained, but luxuriant. The Axis powers had bet everything on the scarcity and eventual collapse of their enemies. They believed that by controlling European oil and labor, and by inflicting maritime damage, they could drain the vitality of the Allies. The K-ration proved this belief was a fantasy. It proved that the enemy had not merely adapted to war, but had industrialized it to a degree that transcended any historical precedent. This abundance was not accidental. It was ideological. The freedom and dynamism of the American economic system, the very values the Nazis ridiculed as decadent capitalism, were the engine that produced the chocolate bar, the chewing gum, and the canned ham. The decentralized, responsive nature of American industry, driven by competition and innovation, allowed it to pivot from civilian to military production with unprecedented speed and scale. This was not the rigid, bureaucratically choked production of the 4-year plan. This was the unleashed power of a free economy. The psychological impact reverberated through the captured ranks. For the German officer, trained to see the war as a test of national will, the abundance in the small box was an immediate refutation of all his ideological training. The Allies were not fighting with the grim determination of necessity. They were fighting with the overwhelming, effortless confidence of surplus. The epilogue to this quiet, personal discovery is found in the final months of the war, as the logistical lines of the Wehrmacht crumbled, as trucks ran out of fuel, as soldiers went hungry, as munitions failed to reach the front. The contrast with the relentless, well-supplied American advance became a daily torture. The sound of the advancing American column was not just the roar of tanks, but the constant, reassuring clatter of supply trucks, their cargo bays filled with an endless stream of food, fuel, and cigarette packs. The K-ration, that small, unassuming box of provisions, ultimately became the Trojan horse of a new kind of warfare. It delivered not just calories, but psychological defeat. It was the physical embodiment of the overwhelming power of a free, abundant, and industrially colossal nation. The moment the German officer cracked the seal on that can of meat, or felt the substantial weight of the American chocolate in his hand, he was not just tasting the enemy's food, he was tasting the future. And that future was not the 1,000-year Reich of scarcity and rigid control, but a world defined by the democratic capacity for creation and distribution, a capacity that had already, quietly and decisively, won the war. The K-ration proved that they had not been defeated by superior tactics or greater courage, but by a logistical truth. The United States was simply too wealthy, too efficient, and too free to be defeated. The war, they realized, was a logistical impossibility for the Axis, and the only remaining question was when the relentless stream of American abundance would finally overwhelm the battlefield.